Missing our children intensely is something we all struggle with. But what if there was a way to feel our kids around us more and feel more connected to them? Well, today's guest is going to tell us how, so don't go anywhere. Today, I'm so excited to have Rachel Pearson on the Angel Moms podcast. She's a professional evidential medium and has been serving spirit and clients since 2016. Her son Perry's physical death in 2015 opened Rachel up to her mediumship abilities. Many of Rachel's clients are bereaved parents. She's also the author of her memoir, Started Up, and hosts her own podcast called Get Spirited. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Before we get started, I would love to hear more about your son, Perry, and if you're comfortable, for you to share your experience with grief.
Absolutely. So my son Perry was 17 when he passed away in 2015 in July. And we as a family our family is comprised of his two younger siblings as well. And as a family, we were living in Ohio for the summer where my husband was doing consulting work there. And Perry is intelligent. He's very active. He was a Boy Scout. Bossy oldest sibling, all the oldest sibling things. But it was very unexpected when he passed, Lisa, and he had taken a synthetic LSD called 25I. And it wasn't until after his passing that we learned more about what the drug is. It's considered a party drug, just like LSD. We learned he and his friends would not have considered it harmful, not an addictive drug or anything like that. But when he died, we didn't know what had happened. And so he had gone for a bike ride that evening of July 27th. And his dad and I were actually getting ready to take a walk in the neighborhood, asked him if he wanted to go with us. He's like, no, I'm going to go ride my bike. It was literally at dusk. And this is something he had been doing there, being away from like home and in this new space. It was like an outlet for his energy that he'd been going on bike rides. And he went on bike rides with his dad there. And it's something we'd been there about, I think, around 8 weeks up to this point for the summer, in Ohio where we were. And so, not a big deal. Again, he would be back by dark. He was always home, like maybe pushing it, but when he would say he would be home, he would always be there, return. And it got to be dark, and this anxiety came over me. And I told my husband, Craig, I was like, he should be home. And he's like, well, it's just now getting dark. And I'm like, no, something's not right. And so waited as it got, my husband's reassuring, oh, I'm sure he'll be here and all that, and waited around a little bit. And then when it got to be dark, my husband became anxious too. And we decided to go on a drive to look for him. And so we went off in the direction where Perry and my husband would often ride bikes in the evening together, or we did as a family as well on the weekend. So we went to this particular trail. And at this point, Lisa, it was already dark. It was probably about 10:30 where it was summer. The days were longer. So it was already, again, like late. And as we were driving towards the trail, in my mind's eye, or as a projection of my mind's eye, I actually saw Perry like lying face down, almost like as on ground. I could tell there was grass, there was dirt, and all this. And I told Craig, I said, he's not this direction. Like, he's not this. I just knew, I just felt like my body knew we were not traveling in the direction where he was. And so Craig turned the car around. I couldn't in that moment tell my husband about my experience. It was just, there was already too much anxiety, but I did tell him as we were driving. I don't remember this. He says that I did. And so as we were driving back, we went past the police station and stopped there. My husband went in while I waited in the car. He came out and said, no, this is not like our jurisdiction. Apparently we lived like on the border. And so the area that we lived in was more in this other jurisdiction, but we had to go to the other city's police station to file a police report. So we went to the other, which interestingly enough, Perry was actually in that jurisdiction of the place where we first stopped at.
The first
But
one.
anyway, yeah. So we went, did what they told us to do. The police were very, a little bit condescending. And I think, if he had been 12 or 13 younger, it would have been handled differently. But they were like, oh, he's 17. He's probably made a new friend. And he had met a girl like in our neighborhood and had been walking in the evenings with her. And, I'm sure he'll come back. And it was like, no, this isn't like him. And I want to be clear that Perry was our daring child. We've heard stories afterwards of him sneaking out with friends, hanging out on the roofs of buildings, things like this. But it still wasn't like him not to be home. That was the one thing he was always, I think, really went to extremes to make sure he was home on time, right? So we knew that this was not his personality. This was not his typical behavior. They asked about friends. So another aspect of this is that Perry had friends that were supposed to be coming to visit from Tennessee, like our hometown, about a 6-hour drive, that next day. Right. And he was on the phone with them just before he went off. So then there were questions about, well, maybe the friends came here, and not to get into all of that, but that was something else that came up. And the police were like, well, maybe he's hanging out with friends. We'll call, we'll check on all this. And we'll find him. Don't worry, or he'll come home. And so we went back to like the condo that we were staying in. And before this, I had even like reached out to one friend who was not going to be coming to visit him the next day, but he was online and Perry's computer was open and they had been chatting. And he said, well, I'll let his other friend know. And because he was talking to Perry and all this, anyway, we never could get through to his friends that night, or his friends wouldn't return our calls. So my husband tried to get some sleep because it was dark and we had already driven around the immediate vicinity. We had walked around, and there was really nothing we could do without light, right? And so I was like emailing. I couldn't sleep. My husband was able to sleep for a couple hours. We got up at the break of dawn and went and drove around again, walked in the vicinity. And I had been in emailing. They actually were even patrolling. We saw them like actually in the complex where we were staying there. And Perry ended up being just like a mile away from where we were. So it was very close to home, and most likely on his way back on a piece of property that had an abandoned farmhouse, and literally walking distance from where we were, but we just hadn't gone there. And it would have been dark and it was off road. So the property was on the road, the house was, but he was like what would have been like the backyard, maybe like an acre or two of land here. So it's not like we would have seen him anyway, but we just didn't even go in that direction. Anyway, so we were driving around, and it was about early to mid-morning when I got a call from the detective who said they found his bike, because we had submitted pictures of Perry and his bicycle and all that, and that they found his bike. And so they told us where and to come and meet them there. And when we got there, we could see Lisa, the tape and everything. And they hadn't found him at that point, but they said, we're going to find him. And all I remember is there was this large, creek, and I know it fed into the river, and I just was thinking like worst case scenario, like, oh my gosh, his body we'll never find his body, and all these what ifs going through my head. Are his friends here? Just all the things, the questions from the police that they were asking us. It was just we were in a total state of shock and confusion, right? And I remember going home, driving back to the condo where we would tell our kids, when they woke up that Perry hadn't come home. But I also called my parents to let them know that they needed to come. I think I knew, just the situation itself. I don't know that was an intuitive thing at that point, but just knowing that they found his bicycle, they were looking for him, and he wasn't with his bicycle and all of that, regardless of what had happened, this wasn't good, right? And so we got home, and I was so antsy, and the police had said, just stay home, we'll let you know, we'll keep you updated. And it maybe had been an hour, if that, but it felt like an eternity. And I told my husband, like, we have to go to the police station. I just can't sit in here any longer. And as soon as we walked out the door, we saw the police cars pull up. And so my husband and I were standing outside. At this point, it was like kids were playing. It was summertime. They were all like, things going on. And as the police officers approached us, I saw the one man shirt, and embroidered on his shirt said coroner. And so, I haven't talked in detail about this in a while, but at that point, this part is always difficult for me. Probably always will be. But I collapsed, and I remember the police asking, "Is there anything we can do?" And about a year prior, Perry had a friend of the family, classmate, that had a fatal car accident. But this young lady was in a coma for about a year before she actually passed away. And when we went to visit the family right away, when we heard of the accident, on the way there, he was like, "Mom, when I die, I want my organs to be donated." I was like, "Oh, well, that's something for your future wife, your kids, And all I could think of that was that moment, and the police asking that. And I was like, "Well, could you donate his organs?" That just came in. And they said because of the heat, because it had been extremely hot and the body had been out overnight, that they wouldn't be able to donate the organs. So we went inside. But, Lisa, in hindsight, I think even there was protection with this, because if we hadn't been outside, the police would have came in, and my husband and I were able to tell our kids on our own without the police, them finding out that way, which I'm sure my kids had their own trauma, us telling them about their brothers passing. But anyway, so we were able to take the kids upstairs and tell them. And then my parents arrived and we told them. And so pretty much that's where the journey begins. And even though that was like the worst day of my life, it doesn't end there. It didn't end there. Right. And so just, yeah, I had these abilities, before Perry passed, to be able to sense, spirit, God. I was raised in a religious household. My dad's a Pentecostal minister. And so that's what I was born into. But I had experiences throughout my life where I could feel, and I used to say, and I was probably taught this too, I felt God or spirit, or the Holy Spirit is how I would describe it. So I began having experiences of Perry being around. And something I hadn't experienced before were the personal synchronicities, like the timing of things happening, signs, and feeling him. And just especially around the memorial, we went back to Tennessee for his memorial service, and the days prior to that and after, there were a lot of synchronicities and signs, and me just feeling and wanting to believe desperately that he was still alive. But having these familiar experiences that I'd had all my life, but never quite understood as well. Right. And so even though that I can't imagine going through this journey without it, and it's what motivates me to continue to do the work that I do, it didn't take away my grief.
No.
It didn't. I still had all the grief experience that I know other bereaved parents experience. And so when I reflect upon that time, back in 2015, the signs, the synchronicities, the communication that I began to receive from Perry was amazing. However, the predominant feeling of going back then is the grief, and I remember saying this and feeling like the world, the firm foundation, like the earth beneath us had just like opened up, and it swallowed me whole. And I remember every day, just the first time in my life, I feel like I have to just be present and get through one day at a time. And I needed to for my kids.
Yes.
And my husband and I wanted to for each other, and supporting our kids and each other. And every time I would kind of veer off from that, thinking about how am I going to live like a year without him? How will I get to his birthday? How will we get through Christmas? And even those thoughts were devastating and overwhelming. And I had to continuously stay focused in the present moment. That was a big part of my grief journey. And really, I think what led me to my healing, of just putting one foot in front of the other when I could, and then also allowing myself to just cry, to just stay in bed all day if I needed to. That first year was very chaotic, very up and down for me. And it wasn't a linear path, as I'm sure you and your listeners can relate to. It certainly was up and down and backwards, and this fear, this overwhelming fear of like, how, how am I going to live like 5, 10, 20 years without my son here physically? Yeah, that those kind of thoughts and feelings consumed a large part of that first year. And at the same time, I began having more and more spiritual experiences of connection with Perry, and Perry coming to me and having experiences of seeing in my mind's eye children he was with him with these other kids, and then having these experiences of meeting the parents later, and that validating to me there was more going on here than I had expected. I didn't always know what was happening until hindsight. It was like he would connect the dots, and then I would go, "Oh, wait a minute! This I just met these parents in support group meeting, and this is their daughter, and this was how I saw Perry this morning with this little girl with this dress on, and this is the picture of their little girl that they're showing me." So it was a lot of those kind of experiences that I had as well, but it didn't take away, that validated for me personally that I have no doubt that Perry and all of our kids are alive and well and supporting us, and not in another geographical location. I don't believe heaven is another geographical location, but that our kids are right here alongside us. And having that said, it still didn't take away my grief journey. So I appreciate you asking about my grief journey, because I get asked a lot about my spiritual experiences, but to be able to share that is important.
I think a lot of what you have experienced and what I experienced early on in my grief journey, a lot of similarities. As I shared before we hit record, Katie in spirit came to visit me hours after she passed away, in a very similar way that her grandmother had come to me 25, 30 years ago. And I won't repeat the story too much, just because the listeners can go back a couple of episodes and listen to all the details. But I think you nailed it perfectly. Having this spiritual connection with our child, however that looks, a brief interaction, a dream, a sign, it's reassuring. It gives us hope, but it doesn't take away from the grief, the pain, the heartache, the questions, the fear, all of what you said. So, at what point did you think, okay, I would like to develop this more? Was there kind of something that happened, or was it just something that you felt, as you said, that you have a lot of feelings around the spiritual connection? Tell us about that. How did this all become to where you are now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't recall a specific time. I think it kind of developed over time, that feeling of wanting to understand what was happening to me. Right. And I remember years ago, Lisa, being intrigued by like James Van Prague, and like reading a book of his and seeing him on TV. But even after I began having these experiences, I didn't necessarily equate that with being a medium. Right. Like, I think because maybe I'd seen these edited versions on TV, and I just didn't really understand, because it didn't happen that I just began giving readings that like developed, right? So I didn't realize I had that ability to that extent. I didn't know, honestly, in the very beginning. I assumed it was just for me, for Perry reassuring me, I'm good, I'm okay. And I know that it was for my own healing. And I don't believe that we can help others without receiving healing for ourselves as well. But again, I didn't know. And then over time, it began to, I feel like almost my experiences became shifted from it being predominantly Perry and him showing me or telling me who he was with, during what I would call them like waking dreams, right? Like, people have these experiences in dream state a lot. I just had them like while I was awake randomly. And get a shift from him being the predominant person to him stepping back, and almost like he was introducing me to people. And then I began having these experiences. Oh, okay. I'm it's like I'm placed in a scene, and I'm where this person lived. This isn't familiar to me. This has to do with the other person. And as I say, he developed me, and spirit developed me that way, kind of organically, just with people I would meet, and I would find myself in support groups with. I had a desire to be with people who had this ability. And I started, I think this is like mediumship. I think this is what a medium does, because the more I would listen to mediums, that for me, they gave me reassurance just listening to medium stories and reading books at that time to know that my son was alive and well. But as I listened to their stories and read the books written by mediums, I realized, this is what's happening to me, right? Like I'm having these experiences as well. So prayer, I prayed a lot, like God, Spirit, Jesus. I had this desire to not just understand, but also feel like what I was doing was okay because of my background and my programming that I had up to that point. And so I would pray, God, okay, please lead me to the right people. And then synchronicities would happen. And so my first mentor I found was online, and she just freely mentors people. She has a Catholic background. So even though I don't have a Catholic background, that the prayers, there was that familiarity there, right? That I felt comfortable with. And I stayed with her for a while and my first mentorship in person that I attended was actually one of James and Prague's in California. And so I needed to, because these experiences were happening remotely, Lisa, I had never been in person. And so I felt like I really want to be in person with people and see if I can do this in person, and just to be under someone's mentorship who is experienced at this and I respect and they're reputable. That really helped me. So I hope that makes sense the way I explained it. So it was probably, I went to James and Prague's mentorship like a year, like August of 2016. So things happened pretty quickly. And I began to have that desire pretty early on to understand my abilities and what was happening. And if nothing else, just to get that camaraderie, maybe that support of others who also had these abilities that would help give me that reassurance too.
So interesting how it really started organically. It's not like you sat down, I'm going to learn how to do this, but it just kept
No,
coming and probably getting those little pokes and prods from Perry at the same time, really highlighting the fact that you had this ability. Now, true or false, I have heard that on some level, we all have some ability. Like was compared to almost singing. Like some people can barely carry a tune in the bucket, like in the shower, like me. And some people are Celine Dion, but we all
sure.
physically can sing. Just some of us do it really well and some of us not so much. And that psychic abilities, or the ability to communicate with those who've passed on, we all have. Some are really good and some could use a lot of work. Would you concur with that?
True.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. Yes. And I believe it's like the natural or divine order of things, or healing order of things. Even when you think about it, like you and Katie, like there's nobody closer to her than you, right? So if you go to a medium, the medium is tuning into your connection with your daughter, right? And so you're the one that she's always with. And so when I end readings, I'll start to feel somebody go back with their people, and I'll actually express that. I'll say that, okay, they're starting to go back with you. Do you have any questions? And so you're the one that Katie is always with. I feel like we all have that ability to develop that communication, and certainly to receive communication from our own loved ones in spirit, our angels, our spirit helpers, certainly. And now, when we talk about mediumship as far as working as a medium, then we cross over into being able to consistently connect with a stranger, right? So like you may have heard like the analogy of a radio dial. Like you already have like Katie's radio station, right? You have this soul connection with her, and you have a lifetime of memories and experiences with her and her personality. So you're already tuned into her. Now, the problem, the challenge we have rather with our own people is that they're so familiar that we can think it's our imagination, right?
Right.
So if
Yes.
Katie comes into you in the morning and she's here, beautiful, and her mom smiling and greeting you for the morning, you're likely to think it's your own memory of her because she's so familiar to you, right?
Right.
Whereas if she say comes to me on your behalf, I'm like, oh, I know, I have no doubt that this would be her because I don't have those memories of her here. She's not someone who's familiar to me in an earthly sense, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, I do believe we all have those abilities. I believe too, Lisa, that we can develop. I've seen this in mentorship that I do when I do circles, like people will surprise themselves that they can connect for other people. And maybe sometimes it's part of our own healing journey that spirit allows that to happen. And like you said, maybe it's like the person who, if I do karaoke or sing, like a singing analogy, like I'm not that good, but maybe I can impress myself with like a little bit. I'm like, oh, was that, I did pretty good there, but I certainly can't carry a tune in a bucket for very long, right? So maybe there are parts I can hit, but I can't hit the whole thing. But to be able to develop to connect with a stranger, right, and for a stranger, and to the point that we can sustain that connection and have that back and forth conversation for an extended period of time is a whole different ballgame, right? It's a different dynamic than being able to develop. But I really feel like the tools or the things that we do or practice can be similar to help us develop either way.
Right. So really, to simplify this, I mean, it's not a simple topic at all, but that it's a skill that we can work on. We can get better at it, even if we're not very good at it right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even if we don't feel like we have that as an innate ability, we can
Mhm.
develop that.
Love
Yeah.
that. I think the next perfect question, at least in my mind, is can you explain to us what happens when we physically die? And I think that that's an important phrase, physically die. I mean, I've always thought of this, my body as a rental, that is here to carry my essence around while I'm living my human life. I don't know where that came from. That's just something that's always been in my head. I'm a science girl. I'm data driven, even though I have this incredible spiritual side. Um, but one thing in my mind that can never be disputed, and every scientist on this planet will back it up 100%. If we think back to grade 10 science, I think it was, is energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change
Right.
forms.
Right.
So, um, explain to us what happens when we die.
Sure. And no, this is just from my perspective, right? Like, based on my experience, both personally and as a medium, and I don't have all the answers. And I feel like there's more than one way. I love your analogy of borrowing this body, like our soul borrowing. Like, I love that because that really resonates with me as well. I feel as if, yeah, like our soul is in our body or connected or maybe tethered, like we're tethered to this human experience through our bodies, right? And then once we die, it's like our soul is released, right? And I feel like then we become like the full expression of our soul, right? We're here. I feel like we have those moments, but I often wonder myself, Lisa, if the moments that we have where we feel spirit or we're in the flow or those moments of aha are moments where we're actually connecting with our soul that isn't just contained in our body, but we have those moments of being aware, okay, I'm bigger. So I feel like when we have those moments of like something bigger is going on here, like we're actually connecting through the part of our soul that purely through our soul, I should say. We're not letting our body, our humanness always get in the way or keep us tethered here. But we do have those moments. And often this happens to people when they're sleeping. We'll have dream visits from loved ones. And I believe it has to do with our logical mind shutting off
Mhm.
and that kind of being the switch that allows us to connect to our soul. So whether it resonates with somebody that think a part of your soul is always on the spirit side, maybe with your loved ones. And when you have those moments of connection, you're connecting through maybe your higher self or your soul, because our soul is much bigger than our bodies and our bodies can't truly contain it. So when we die, it's like we're released from that connection. And rather than, I don't like the word formless, or rather, I feel like, because I was thinking about this before I came on and looking over your questions, I don't I feel like maybe spirit doesn't like the word formless, but maybe limitless, right?
Mhm.
Like we don't have the limits, although it could technically is considered formless, right? We don't have the physical form, but
Right.
limitless, I feel like spirit likes, where they feel like, and I feel as if when we die, just based on this impression that there's a sense of freedom,
Mhm.
right? And this sense of like being able to be in more than one place at once, right? And I believe the same dynamic that allows spirit to communicate through me, with me, regardless of where I am in the world from a client, right? Because they're not bound by the physical constraints that we have while we're in our body. And I do believe like anything here that we carried with us, maybe emotional baggage that we're able to see clearly and process. And I like the analogy of like here. So an example I use a lot is I had an early first marriage that failed, and I married very young, and it lasted just 2 years. At that point in my life, that was the most devastating thing I had gone through. So I can still remember being grief stricken back then and just being like 21, right? 21, 22. And it took years for me to heal. It took therapy, it took introspection to heal from that, to get to this place of now when I think about my first husband, I don't have any hard feelings at all. You know, I can see how we were both young. I can see like the bigger picture, right? And I feel like when we pass, it happens instantaneously. Like we get to that space. So anything here, any emotional baggage we carried with us, we heal from almost like instantaneously. So I feel like there's that sense of physically feeling limitless, but
Yeah.
also emotionally feeling that freedom as well.
Mhm. So interesting. And I think that that beautifully explains how our children can be in spirit, be with us. We can't see them, we can't touch them, but they can still be with us and we can sense them because they don't have that rental. They're not wearing that rental anymore, that body, right?
Right.
And they're in
Yeah.
that limitless form, or something that isn't held into a vessel of some kind.
Yes.
um how can we open up our minds more? Because I think as humans, and again, this is just my perspective, but as humans, we are wired to be logical. We are wired to, everything is black and white. Show me the proof. I've got to be able to touch it, see it, all that kind of thing. But I also think that we have been conditioned, whether it's through our upbringing, through formal religion, through a variety of things, that this thing can't exist. How can we open our minds up to the possibility that this other existence does exist?
Yeah, I love the question. I love that the point that you make, and I want to circle back around to that about conditioning, because I really feel like the more we can pay attention and maybe reprogram ourselves, which requires a lot more, maybe deeper work, to live in that space more and on an ongoing basis. I also believe that like spirit, like our loved ones in spirit, understand the human condition, right? They've
Mm,
lived it and they also understand that. And even evidential mediumship is about proving to their loved ones through evidence, right? So they totally get that. Lisa, I love just starting with the breath, right? So when I'm leading workshops or classes, I just really just start with your breath. Sometimes we can complicate it. And I believe we can sometimes make spiritual connection. We can turn it into a religion in and of itself if we're not careful, or we have to do this and this, which really is all logical brain connected, right? Like,
yeah.
what do I have to do? Give me a how to. But really, I like to tell people you have the only tool you really ever need is your breath. And so let's say at the end of a long day, maybe you've had a hectic day, you might find you need to sit with your breath longer. For me, first thing in the morning, and for a lot of people, first thing in the morning. So I like to recommend like starting with your natural rhythm. Like, when do you feel most centered, most at peace? right? Before, for me, it's before my day starts, before I get on my phone. I'm not really a TV person, but maybe for somebody before they turn the TV on. So for me, it's right after I wake up and I take advantage of that, right? And so it's not actually a formal meditation. I just go with my natural rhythm. And I find that when I just literally focus on my inhale, my exhale for a little while, I will start to receive maybe downloads from spirit or a connection with a loved one, maybe my son or another loved one, depending on what my intention is. And sometimes I might have one intention, but something else happens, right? But I will usually have some sort of spiritual experience connection for me that time of the day just by focusing my breath. And what happens when we focus on our breath, we shift out of our head and our logical thoughts. And so again, sometimes it'll take longer depending on like what energetic state you're in when you sit down or lie down, but literally just by bringing your awareness to your inhale, your chest rising, and your exhale after a few minutes. And then I personally, when I'm leading other people, I'll say a prayer. Thank you, Spirit. On my own when I'm doing this. I will usually send my thoughts to spirit, to my son. This has kind of evolved for me over the years. It depends on what one's intention is as far as connecting with your child. Sometimes I feel like when we want it too much, we get in our own way. Right.
Definitely.
So I say, if we could just be open to God, the universe, great grandma, whoever is here to support me, and try to keep an open mind, but have this intention of really tapping into, and it might be feeling. And I love that you in your intro talked about feeling, because I feel like that's the most common way all of us are able to connect. And the most frequent way that all of us connect with our children is through feeling their presence. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that's really the most endearing way I feel my son at this point in my journey. But I've had those experiences of telepathy, of seeing him and hearing him. But just by bringing awareness to our breath and breathing into their presence. Also, something that I will share is pretending. Like, what if you wake up and pretend that your child is right here with you, and you talk to them and you pretend they're here and they're just invisible? Yeah. And then maybe your child, or for spouses, I'll say this, this has come through in readings before, pretend I'm there and pour me a cup of coffee, so maybe for somebody whose spouse has passed, have that cup of coffee with them that you would have, invite your child to go, if you guys like to go shopping and go to Starbucks together, talk to them like they're really here, because they are. And it's okay if you feel a little bit like doubtful or skeptical, because they will prove it to you, right? They will meet us halfway. So, but that's one way that we can meet them halfway, is by saying, okay, for some reason the name Lexi's coming to me. I know your daughter's name is Katie though, right? Whoever's listening to this. Okay, let's go shopping today and go get coffee. And, I'd love it if you give me a sign, and then pay attention to your nudges. Maybe you get in the car and you're like, actually, I think I want to turn Pandora on instead of the podcast. And then the perfect song comes on, and then you go and there's the Starbucks sign, the coffee shop has like the barista's name is your child's name, right? And pay attention to that. And I like journaling too, as a way to reflect upon that and to record it and to really strengthen this new relationship. So go have your experience, have your date, come home, journal about it as a little thank you to them. And, maybe we can catch up again next Friday, or, the more that the intentional we can make it, I feel like the more we actually set ourselves up to be perceptive of their presence. Because I feel like, Lisa, they're always close by, but by doing things like this, and they like it, they tell me, you don't have to make it woo woo. You don't have to lay all the crystals out in a circle and light the candles, pretend we're going on a date, but do something that you would naturally do with them, or that that they like to do here.
It's so ironic that you said have coffee together. One of the things that I did, it was part of my ritual in the morning. My husband took my then 15-year-old son to high school, dropped him off, and then my husband would go to work for a short period of time. And I would have coffee with Katie.
Oh,
We had her ashes in the front room where Katie and I would often sit and talk about life. And she was at that stage in life where she was thinking about university and, all the things that are happening at that stage in life. And some of the things that I honestly miss the most are those talks. But I would literally get my chair and pull it up close to the little table where her ashes were, have my coffee, and I had a bit of a routine.
Yeah.
And it was, not really being raised in a formally religious home. I felt like I didn't know how to pray. So I would recite the Lord's Prayer. That was my way of getting in touch with God. Um, and then I would literally talk to Katie. I would, depending on the day, I would either just tell her what's going on around the house, even though I feel like she was there, she was seeing it, she was experiencing it, or Jeepers Creepers, your brother is, just about driving me crazy, or crying, and just saying the things to her that I didn't get to say. I never got to say goodbye, just like you didn't.
Right.
The things, we all have mom regret, and just like whatever came to my mind and was on my heart. Sometimes those talks were 2, 3 minutes. Sometimes they were an hour and a half. And I will always say that time was the best therapy that I ever had. Even though I did go to therapy, totally believe in therapy, love support
Right.
groups, all the things. That was a really special time for me. And I think I did it pretty much every day, probably for 10 months. And then as I eased back into work and all that kind of thing, that it kind of became less of a habit. I will
Sure.
still do it, but I think that is a great place to start. Have coffee with your child, have whatever. The other thing that has been really helpful for me, and I'd love to hear your weigh in on this, is when I'm in nature, when I
Yes.
am walking, like no headphones, like it's just me and I'm walking. That's when I tend to get my downloads, if you want to call them that,
Yes.
or the nudges, or even the thoughts that come into my mind. It's like, oh, something that I hadn't thought of before. Um, to me, nature and walking are almost a bit of a meditation. I don't know what your
Yes.
thoughts are.
I love that. And no coincidence about the coffee, right? Knowing that Katie is
Nope,
helping us.
no coincidence.
Uh, yeah. So we live in the city and don't have like, nice nature walking trails, but even just getting
Mhm.
out and walking, like moving our bodies and getting out in nature is great. And I love that you said downloads, Lisa, because my husband and I go camping. And so we'll go up into northern Arizona where we live in the desert and near Phoenix. We'll go up to northern Arizona, where the trees are and everything. And after a couple of days, like I get all these downloads. I always get antsy. I got to write. I take my journal with me because I do feel like in those camping trips and just being immersed in nature, whether it's hiking or just sitting outside without the distractions of modern life,
Mhm.
I get that higher wisdom and guidance and downloads. So I believe that is a beautiful way too. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I get this in readings a lot, validations of signs that parents get happen to be, there's not a coincidence, it's outside a lot, right? The butterflies, the heart-shaped rocks, right? It's like, oh, you were by the creek and they gave you a rock. And I believe that and often they'll say, oh yeah, they'll know it was a sign from them. Sometimes not, and they're validating that, yeah, that was a sign from your son or daughter. But it's not a coincidence. And they also know that that's very healing for us too, to be in nature, right? So yeah.
And I think for myself, that is very much a positive feedback cycle, because I am a big believer that self-care, getting outside, getting fresh air, moving our bodies is very therapeutic, even if it's just the physical sense. But when I can go out without my earphones and I can feel connected to Katie, or I can get an extra sign, or guess what I'm going to do more often? I'm going to get outside and go for those
Yeah.
walks, right?
Yeah.
Because of the way that I feel. So, some definite positive reinforcement there. You touched on something a few minutes ago, and I want to circle back to that. I do it myself, even though I'm a big believer. I have no doubt in this spiritual connection I have with Katie. But how can we tell when it's sort of, what's the word I'm looking for here? Is it when it's a real sign or just really, really, we want it to be a sign?
Oh,
I saw a social media post that you made a while back, and I'll probably maybe get it a little bit wrong, but you said just because you find a feather doesn't mean it's a sign. So how do we know what we're getting here, if it's a sign or not?
I know. I always feel like I'm doing a little bit of a balancing act here when I talk about this, because I do want to encourage people to, hey, why don't you assume it's a sign, and you can always be proved later. But I really think that speaks more to people who might always be skeptical, or maybe just opening up to signs. Me personally, I'm like you. Like, I don't collect pennies that I see on the sidewalk because I've never felt nudged to, right? So, um, but for some people, pennies are their sign. They'll bring them through in readings and connections. And it's a little bit of a challenge for me discussing it, because I don't want to discourage people from considering that what they're overlooking might be a sign. But I am like you, Lisa, where if I were to be thinking about it, like Perry sends me feathers still. I got a lot the first year, but if I were to be looking out for feathers when I'm going for a walk, for me, that would take away from, I would be in my brain, I would be in my head, it would take away from maybe me feeling that intuitive connection with him and him leading me to it. So I know some people have a challenge feeling the presence of their loved ones or feeling those nudges. And I do believe that our loved ones in spirit can use big signs as a way to open us up to feeling their presence on a more intimate level. So again, I don't want to discourage people, but my feeling for me personally is that not everything is a sign. And Spirit has validated this in readings in kind of funny ways sometimes. And it's like, well, she thinks it's a sign, but I do know about it. I was there. I do see her looking for these signs or calling them signs. So I think from our kids' perspective, in spirit, that they just want us to know that they're here and they're present in our lives, even if maybe they didn't send us the bird, but they were with us when we saw the bird and we thought of them,
Yeah.
But for me personally, I'm like you. I think it takes away from the experience if I'm looking for a specific sign. So rather try not to let your head, and try to maybe begin by observing your thoughts. So if somebody's listening to this, like, are you going to the store and thinking, oh, I'm going to be looking for feathers? Where's my feather? I got to look for feathers. Then to me, that feels like you're trying to conjure the sign, right? Versus, sure, I know our kids are on our minds a lot, especially early grief, and always thinking them, it's okay, send a thought. Hey, it'd be great, Katie, if you could send me a sign today, and try to let go. And that's a good starting point, I think, if you're somebody who is looking for a specific sign, and maybe because you've gotten specific signs, like this is their signature sign, right? Try to let go of that, though, and to be open to the fact that they can send you different signs or various signs. And for me, if I attach to a specific sign, I'm just going to get in my head with it and I'm going to start looking for it. So if I'm wanting a sign from Perry and it's been a while, I'll be like, hey, it'd be really nice if you could send me a sign. Then I let go. So it's about setting the intention, but then letting go of the thought. So give yourself some time and space. So maybe you're planning a trip and you really want your child to show up and let you know they're with you on this vacation, right? So rather than like asking for a sign while you're there the whole time, set the intention, maybe meditate, journal, talk to them before you go, and give yourself time and space to let go of it, so that when they send you the sign, it's not something that's in your consciousness. You'll have more trust that it's from them. Right? Because when we're thinking about it, even if they send it to us, we're going to have a hard time trusting it's from them if we're conjuring the thought ourselves.
I've always heard, and I guess I'm a bit of a believer, that we get what we need, not always what we want from spirit. And I think the same can be said for a reading. I don't remember where I heard this from, but if we make an appointment for a reading and maybe we're a little skeptical and we think, I'm not going to believe this woman unless she tells me about the event on January, 20, whatever, when Katie had her little red wagon and, blah, 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 detail. And that is the only way that I will trust that this is real. that often you'll go away disappointed. And that we don't get necessarily the messages that we want. Maybe we want our kids to tell us, I don't know, when my son will meet his someone or whatever. But maybe the message I need to hear is something entirely different, and that we have to go in to the signs or the readings or the what have you, just with this open mind that I would love to connect with my child and hear whatever it is that I need to hear. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that is the perfect energetic state to go into a reading, is that being open to, okay, saying a prayer, sending a thought to them, trusting that you're going to be able to communicate with me, and understanding that mediums have their filters too, right? They have to communicate through our own minds too. So they might be trying to give something that the medium just isn't going to be able to get the reference for. But I find that they typically can, in a way, even if it's not in a way that the person might expect them to come through and talk exactly about the little red wagon, but maybe they talk about that time in their lives when she was 6 years old and we lived in this house, something that related. But sometimes people miss even that if they're expecting very, very specific details, and they have in mind what they want those exact details to be.
Right.
And I've had it work both ways. It's interesting to me because as a medium, I've had spirit come through with something and the person say, oh my gosh, I told them to talk about this if this was really them. And it will usually come through with some random piece of information that's not really fitting in the conversation that I'm having with the spirit communicator at the time. And an eagle comes into the picture when they're talking about reuniting with grandma, and it's like, oh, I told them to talk about the eagle if that was really, and for example. Then there are other times where it's like, yeah, they don't bring through that one thing, but they bring through a lot of other very evidential details and loving messages and things that I couldn't possibly know. And I think that people can overlook that, and it takes away from the meaning of the overall meaning of mediumship if we're expecting, specific details from them. And I can also feel, Lisa, and this might be something interesting that your listeners might appreciate, I can feel when that energy is there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having done this for so long now, I can feel when the spirit communicator is talking to me, well, let's say it's mom or different, it's not just parents. It's just a human experience, right? Of having expectations. When the person here has some specific expectation, I can feel it. It's almost like somebody, go poking at me while I'm trying to have a conversation, like energetically, right? So not only, I guess so. Just furthermore, just it can interfere with the reading to an extent, so you actually help the medium more if you can say, hey, I would love for you to bring through something that I will know it's just you, that the medium couldn't possibly know, and leave it at that. And leave it at that. Yeah.
My next question, which I think you've just answered honestly, was how can someone prepare themselves for a good experience with a medium? And what I have taken out from what you have just said is go in with an open mind and an open heart, perhaps set an intention ahead of time. Katie, I really hope you're there because I'd really like to connect with you. You know, please tell me what I need to know. Is there anything further? Maybe some breath work? What else can a person do to prepare to have the best experience possible?
So that, brother, I like giving yourself like transition time. For me, it's just like what I do in my normal life throughout my day, right? Like, so let's say you're just coming home from work, try not to schedule it like, 15 minutes after you get home from work. Give yourself time to sit down, have a cup of tea, relax. And then if you could also spend like, say, 15 minutes just in a quiet space where you're not going to be interrupted, and also ensure you're not going to be interrupted or distracted during the reading, of just breath work, or maybe listening to some pleasant music or meditation music, whatever for you helps you feel relaxed and peaceful. And kind of like the breath work will help you shift from those thoughts of, please send me the red wagon. But our loved ones understand. So I think sometimes it's good to express that, like, hey, Perry, I really want you to show them the bicycle, but if you can't, that's okay. Sometimes just expressing that, writing it or saying it to him kind of helps me release it and remove myself from that thought, like let the thought escape. So give yourself that time and space. I like to say, talk to them about all the things you'd like them to talk about, but give yourself time and space, after that conversation you have with your loved one in spirit before the reading, whether it's that morning or the night before, and then go into it just relaxing, sending your love to them, connecting to your heart space is always good too. Just like the breath work, bring your awareness after you do a couple of minutes of just sitting with your breath. Bring your awareness to your heart space, send out your loving thoughts to them, imagine, visualize them there. And that often helps us shift and really step into that energy that's ideal.
I love that. So, for any of our listeners, Rachel, you do readings, you've got your book, you've got an upcoming cruise in 2025, you've got so many resources. Where is the best place for our listeners to go to find out all of this good stuff about you?
It is rachelpearson.net, and that has my website. And thank you for your kind words, Lisa. Would you mind if I interject something I wanted to
Not at
circle
all,
back around
please.
to? Because as soon as you said it, I thought this is perfect because it came up a couple of times. Starting with when you said you didn't have a particularly religious background, so you learned to pray. For our listeners who do have a religious background, prayers can be very helpful because I find that fear, Lisa, of like, is this evil? That can really be an obstacle to having a good reading, or for somebody even having a reading to begin with. Ask your child, God, but whatever prayers make you comfortable, say those prayers. And I love that you, with your ritual with Katie, that you would say a prayer. I really feel like you have an advantage with that, not having that programming, right? Like it doesn't sound like you had fear around it at
No.
all. But for a lot of people who were raised or still maybe part of a religious, community, that can be a real challenge, is getting past the stigma and the fear. So before you go into a reading, saying that prayer before you do the breath work can really be helpful in helping you to, kind of like give it to God, and whatever words, thoughts, prayers you need to say. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think that is such an important part. Um, and I do, my personal belief is that, spirituality and formal religion are not mutually exclusive and that they are actually intermingled, but that is my own belief. But listeners, I highly encourage you to connect with Rachel and learn more about connecting and being connected, and let's get more connected with our children. Rachel, thank you so very much for being here today. I think you and I could talk for another couple of hours, but I really,
Same.
really appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you. Likewise, Lisa. This has been a pleasure and honor for sure. Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.